Welcome to an online presentation of Okanogan Highlands Alliance's Highland Wonders speaker series. We hope that you're all staying healthy and happy out there in the big wide world. We're really excited to connect with you from our homes. We definitely miss seeing everyone in person, and we hope to get back to face-to-face events someday. But one of the perks of this online format is that we're not limited by distance or by space in a building. And so some of you may be joining Okanogan Highlands Alliance for the first time, which is an exciting thought for us. And so I wanted to take a moment to introduce ourselves. OHA is a conservation nonprofit organization located in Tonasket, Washington, that seeks to protect the natural world. And we do this through our work monitoring the Buckhorn gold mine and advocating for clean water, by restoring habitats and bringing fascinating educational opportunities to our community. My name is Jen Weddle, and Sarah Kliegman and I are OHA's co-directors, and we're supported by our senior advisor and one of OHA's founders, David Kliegman, as well as a 7-member board and countless partners and volunteers. So tonight, one of our most dedicated and longtime amazing volunteers is the star of our show. His name is George Thornton, and he is a longtime educator, botanist, community, and civic leader. And he has boundless curiosity for all things related to the natural world, especially in the Okanogan Highlands. He has spent many summers traipsing around the remote areas of Okanogan County, conducting botanical surveys for the Forest Service. And through this experience, he has drawn connections between the geology, the climate, the plants, and the wildlife found in this very special place. This presentation will also be available in podcast format. You can check out the Highland Wonders podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or many other podcast platforms. Thank you all for tuning in. We're thrilled that you are here. It means that you care about this place and are excited to understand the marvels of nature. I'm serious when I say that it fortifies us to know that people care. It means that together we can make a positive difference in our community and our world. And so without further ado, I will turn this over to George and the Okanogan Ice Islands. Enjoy.
Welcome. This is George Thornton. I'm currently the president of the board of the Okanogan Highlands Alliance. I'm from the Oroville area, and what the topic I want to cover today is called Islands in the Ice. And I want to take you back many years. We're talking prior to the end of the last ice age, which around in our area is about at least 15,000 years ago. And this, what you're looking at now is a possible view of what it would have been looking. You would have been looking west from a high point above the glaciers in the highlands. And what you're seeing is just mountaintops and ridges. We know that the various peaks stood out because they have the rather sharp and pointy outline. But if they were completely glaciated, we would have an entirely different shape and look. And as we get into the presentation, you can see that. Additionally, we're going to be looking at that there's a possibility, not absolute, we have limited evidence, that certain plant communities survived for the thousands and thousands of years on these peaks that you see out above the ice. Okay, this is what it might have looked like over 15,000 years ago. And here is what it looks like today. I want to show you that you notice that all of the peaks on the horizon, they've never been eroded by glaciers. They were made sharp and craggy and pointy by glaciers, but the tops were never rounded off. The mountains in the foreground, which are now forested, you can see that they're rounded. They don't have that jagginess to them. they would have been covered by the ice, which acted like sandpaper, a rasp, a grater, and smoothed them out. So you could see the contrast. This picture you see is Hart's Pass looking south and east into south and west into the Cascade Mountains. A large part of the mid-range mountains were ones that have been burned off in recent fires, which, if you look back over the tens of thousands of years, is a fairly common event when you think of common separated by 100 to 200 years at a time. It's just that in our lifetime, we've not experienced this. It can be argued, and maybe we don't really have enough evidence, that fires have become more frequent. And that's a dilemma that we'll wrestle with over the next few decades. Well, let's go on. Here is a a map drawn up showing the extent of the last ice age. And you have in the middle the Okanogan lobe sticking down, and it has dammed the Columbia. And you have the Puget Sound itself, that's on the left-hand side, filled with ice. Out to the far left in the Pacific Ocean, you'll notice the fine dotted line, and that is where the shoreline would have been at the extent of the ice age. The Columbia would then flowed much farther out, depositing the sediments from the interior. Coming back to the Okanogan, to the left of to the right of the Okanogan, in where is now Idaho, there was a small lobe, and it has the label 4 on this map, which dammed the water draining out of the southern edge of the ice flow, of the ice in the glaciers. That backed up an immense lake called Lake Missoula. Periodically, the depth of the lake would get so deep, and the pressure of the water would break through that lobe, and that would be and that's what's being illustrated in this picture, is what we call the Brett's floods. And you can you have the effect that on the basin and down through the Columbia, and it even backed up into the Willamette Valley, depositing a great deal of sediment, which makes it such a great agricultural area today. Equally, the Yakima Valley, you can see water backed up into it. For our purposes today, though, we're underneath that Okanogan lobe. What evidence we have seems to think at Tonasket, you probably had somewhere around 5,000 feet of ice above us, a mile. So if the valley's about 1,000 feet high today, you add at least 5,000 feet to that. So then you're talking an altitude of around 6,000 feet. In the Cascades, it would have been higher yet. So we would be talking maybe 7,000 feet altitude would be the top of the glaciers. And the few peaks above that would have been these sharp pointed and peaks and ridges. The name that's applied to these isolated peaks, these isolated bits of rock, are Nunataks, Nunataks. It's an Inuit word because to the far north, these are still common features today. And so we use the Inuit word when we label these outcroppings. I want to bring up and suggest the possibility that within these glacial areas, there's valleys, and you can see some of the valleys right underneath this label going north. There's mountain peaks, notice to the right, in the Rocky Mountains, that are isolated, completely surrounded by ice. And then there are small ones, which would have been in our immediate area, Chapaka Mountain, Windy Peak, and Tiffany. Now, there's probably more, but those are the ones closest by. And we'll get into how to pick them out and identify them. First, some background. When we refer to these areas which were surrounded by ice, surrounded by glaciers, they're called glacial refugia. if they're up in the mountains, we call them Alpine glacial refugia. They're called refugia because these were areas where there was this strong potential for plants and animals to survive and long periods of time in these, possibly becoming isolated and over a great span of time, to then develop characteristics and features that made them different from the species that they came from. Now we're talking, if we talk glacial refugia in general, they could have been in some feature out in a flatter terrain where for whatever reason the glacier went around it, or in the case of the valleys flowing north from the lakes in the scabland, those valleys could have been refugia. And the same thing is going to apply. They're going to have unique physical features as well as a combination of plant life that makes you wonder about the diversity. Why are things where they're at? Now, so we look for two things: unique terrain, glacier features, erratics, moraines, eskers. We're not going to spend a lot of time with those, because what you find is the peaks do not have these features, and they don't look like they've been ground and smoothed or rounded. They're very peaky and very very craggy. In the regular refuge on flatter land, then you're going to have other features to look for, primarily the unusual plant species. And having spent 20 years with the Forest Service and a lot of time on my own, these are the things that my big background is in, an unusual plant species in our area. And these peaks, which have a possibility to be the Nunataks, to be the remnants that stuck above the glaciers. I'll repeat them: Chapaka, which really is three peaks. It's Chapaka itself, it's Hurley Peak, and it's Joe Mills in that complex. Then you have Windy Peak far to the west, and then south of Windy you have Tiffany. Tiffany's the tallest at about 8,400 feet. Windy's about 82. Chapaka is barely under 8,000 feet. All right. Okay. This is what might be what some of our peaks looked like during the last glaciation. Islands in the ice, just popping up out of this great field of ice. These pictures are stolen from Greenland, but you get the idea. In the foreground, this might have been one thing you notice along that ridge that's near the bottom is kind of the broken rock terrain, that chunky rock that's just lying on the surface. That is characteristic of a Nunatak. So now we have two things: the pointed, jaggy outline, and then you have this rugged, fractured rock terrain, or physical signs. That's a good possibility. These were glaciated. These weren't glaciated, excuse me. The fractured rock, yeah, we have things like that in non-glacial areas, but this rubble is it's blocky. You'd think if it was covered by ice at all, it would have been carried away. Whereas a lot of our when we see rocks lying around at lower altitudes, they have the great appearance. They're talus slopes. They don't have the same feature of just lying on the surface, just a rocky rubble. We'll get into more of that later. Okay, Nunataks is the word again. It has an Inuit origin, and roughly it translates to isolated rock above ice. All right, the ice is melted. The time it took for the ice to melt is very hard for us to know, but you set an ice cube out in rather cold days, and you recognize it takes quite a while. And here we're talking 5, 6, maybe 7,000 feet of ice over the whole interior of this northern fourth of Washington, and then farther north into British Columbia. It's going to be cold. It's going to be windy. You're going to have snow and ice, and some years are colder and some years are warmer. That's no different than today. The sun's going to be the same. It's just as hot. It's just as bright. It has the same day length it has as we have today. But it's a slow warming, and it's going to come and go. But one thing to keep in mind is, where does all the water go? All the snow and ice, it's melting. As your eye gets trained, you can see what the consequence of the great deal of water. One of them is the raise in the ocean levels. We're talking 400 feet rise since the melting of the glaciers. Focusing on the plants, it's a pretty slow process for the return of what the ecological and the plant community, animal community that we see today. A lot of them is going to be introduced naturally. The non-glacial land was less than 100 miles south of us. So the animals that were there, the plants that were there, could reintroduce in our area fairly quickly. But you're talking Arctic tundra. It's really different community of plants. And if there were remnant plants from the tops of the peak, they would have spread downward from those peaks and into areas which resembled those areas that they survived in. Then, as the climate warms yet again, they would have struggled and retreated to the higher terrain again. So there's this ebb and flow up and down the mountains as the climate evolved over the years. There's strong evidence, and that strong evidence is, you find lakes and ponds that have been around a very long time, and you do corings, and then people who know what they're doing look in the mud layers and they can see the pollen grains. And those pollen grains, they're unique to every particular species of plant. And so by looking at the variety of pollen grains, you can find out what the plant communities were like at particular layers of sediment in the bottom of these older ponds. The best guess is 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, it was at least as warm as we're experiencing today, and maybe warmer, and what stayed that way for quite a long time. So this environment changes. The thing that is different today is the speed of change. Okay, so at least 10,000 years, you start getting a more mature landscape. Isolated populations are threatened by changing climate. Here's a view of what a mountaintop looks like today in our area. The top third of the mountain is rather ragged and craggy. In this image, that would have been above the glacial during the last glaciation. Below that, and in the foreground, it's a much more rounded, much more level look to it. And you'll see that the rocks themselves look somewhat smooth. They don't have that cragginess to them. In the background, you'll see vegetation, but going upwards, it stops. It isn't much above that, and that's as much by the conditions as it is. There's just not suitable soil up in those more rugged, craggy areas. But as we get in closer, you're going to begin to find there are plants, there are animals up in those locations. The yellowing you see, those are alpine larch. They're a relative to the larch that we see at our altitude here in, around Lost Lake, the highlands. It's a smaller tree. There's some fine characteristics in the twigs. And in general, the needle shape is a little different, but it's a larch. It loses its needles in the fall, and it has no commercial value, but it's very adapted to these conditions. The branches are short. It doesn't, they're flexible. They won't snap off in cold weather, and they can be a very small tree and be hundreds and hundreds of years of age. On the right-hand side, are kinds of pines. And the pines primarily, but I can't tell too well from this picture, are what's called white bark pine. And we'll get into more of that later. Okay, we're talking, here's some of the things I've just talked about. Craggy and pointy, the lower peak is smooth. You have the fractured rock terrain. So directly below this label, you see what you're looking at is actually Hurley Peak there in the Chapaka complex. It's craggy at the very top. It's got a sharp drop off on one side. It has big meadows facing west and south. Across from that on the bottom is the top of Mount Chapaka. Notice the shattered rock lying on the surface, and it's just what I call rubble. It's just sitting there. They're just all chunky, a lot different than a talus slope. The top picture on the right is Windy Peak looking north, and you can see that it's a very pointy, rugged thing. But where the person is taking the pictures, you can see those boulders are fairly rounded, and that can be as much from the weather rounding them and not glaciers, because they're lying there on the surface. The force of the glacier probably would have moved them away if that had been glaciated. Okay, we're at the top of Mount Chapaka. We're looking down towards Palmer Lake. Oroville and Tonasket are in the next valley over, and you can see Omak Mountain in the background. Omak Mountain was glaciated, at least for some length of time. Notice the top of it and the outline is pretty rounded. You compare that to where we're at in this picture. You have this fractured rock rubble. Down below, you have the Similkameen River coming down from Canada. It's very flat. That would have been gouged out and be a pretty deep valley. But over the thousands of years, not decades, since the last glaciation, it's been completely filled in by sediment and what we call glacial till. That's the stuff that right at the base of the glacier gets dumped by the glacier. But most of this is going to be sediment that's come down from north. In a way, you could call it borrowed land. It's on lent from Canada, and over the long years, it's going to continue moving south. This is mature, meaning it's kind of settled into a pattern you can depend on. It's not going to have any rapid change. You have those U-shaped lakes almost immediate below. Those are what we call oxbow lakes. They were cut as the river used to be very, very kind of sinuous, S-shaped, and then those S bends would be cut off and just become separated lakes. That's a characteristic of a flat, mature landscape. Far to the upper right, you're looking at Palmer Lake. Palmer Lake is rather unusual because water flows into it through the same inlet, outlet, and it goes out during the drier spells. So it kind of acts like a reservoir for the Similkameen River. It's very unusual, not that rare, but just unusual. Okay, top of Mount Chapaka. You've got a few little alpine larch in the foreground. You've got you have some very short heather-like plants. Certain grasses are there, but except for these trees, everything is really short. Notice the rock rubble, chunky, angular, pretty good evidence this was not glaciated. If it were, these would get swept away by the ice. They would be much more ground down than you see here. I borrowed this picture from someone, and you notice the dogs seem to be having a pretty good time up there. Okay, we're looking across at Chapaka, where the last picture was taken. We're on the very top of Hurley Peak. In the foreground, in that meadowy area with those scattered trees, there are some very, very unique plants. One species grows nowhere else in the whole state of Washington. And its closest relatives are hundreds of miles north on other peaks. So these, it's a kind of plant that doesn't move, doesn't move around. It's not wind blowing. It doesn't have, it doesn't move by around real well by other means. And so, it's so unusual. And it was, that gives us a piece of evidence that perhaps these peaks here, we have leftover plants from the last glaciation. On these peaks, straight ahead Chapaka, the foreground is a Hurley, and off to our right, out of view, is Joe Mills. These three peaks together are what we call Chapaka, and it's set aside by our state as what's called a natural area preserve, because it's a real special area. It's isolated from the rest of the Cascades, far in the background. It has a unique collection of plants found nowhere else, at least in this big a combination, nowhere else in the state. And it's just a neat place. We're talking at least 13 species of rather rare plants on between these three peaks. I want to slip into another discussion now that's a feature of glacial activity. In this drawing that you see, the movement of the glacier is like a really slow river. And it's as it moves along from, in this case, left to right, it's as though we would be looking east if we're talking about the Okanogan. On the on the north side, or the uphill side, the glacier rides up, and it just makes it a very smooth slope. It grinds it, and little chunks of rock embedded in the bottom of the glacier get moved along, just acting like gouges, smoothing the surface. But on the south side, that's on the right, it tends to have a much steeper, because chunks of rock, the glacier freezes to it. The rocks are fractured by the pushing of the glacier. Moisture gets in there, it freezes, it cracks them apart. So you get a very abrupt edge on that south side. That's a good piece of evidence that an area has been fully glaciated. That action is called plucking. It's like plucking feathers, except in this case, it's plucking rocks from the downstream, so to speak, flow of a glacier. Here's Mount Hull, just south of Oroville, and here's an lowland example. You have the south face, and you can see up at the skyline is virtually a cliff. Nearby, a little hard to see, but it's very cliff-like also. And there's this much more gentle slope coming on the north side going towards the south. And so this is really good evidence. You see a little bit of talus slope in the middle, but you don't see piles of and a lot of this fractured rock. There's little places, of course. Okay, moving along. Most of you will recognize this. This is Omek Mountain. Excuse me, not Omek. Excuse me. It's Bonaparte. I've been doing a lot of work down in Omek lately, so please forgive me. You'll see the much more gentle slopes, slightly steeper to the left, which tells me that's the south side of the mountain. And where plucking occurred, it made it steeper than on the right-hand side, which is where the glaciers rode up and over the top of the mountain. Here is another view of Bonaparte, and you can see this more gentle slope to the north and the steeper slope to the south from plucking much more distinctly. Top of Bonaparte, you can see rock lying around. It's not a pile of rubble. Many of them are smooth, and there's a fair amount of sand and gravel around, which is helping the plants grow a little bit. So this is, again, for at least some time, the glacier went up and over this. All right. Here we are. We're on Joe Mills Mountain, looking directly east at Hurley Peak. And then beyond that, it's going to be a very abrupt drop down into the Semelkameen River Valley. Over towards our right is Chapaka. And it's a fairly gentle walk over to Chopaka Mountain, maybe a mile. In the foreground, you see little orange strips. That's marking rare plants. When I was up there this last summer, we were surveying to locate for these rare plants, I and a volunteer. And so wherever we found them, we put out the little yellow markers. So this is the trees you see, the one roughly in the center, slightly to the right, that's a white bark pine. You have spruce in here. There's I believe there's even some alpine fir. But on the trees, you have various heather-like plants and grasses. So you don't have a lot of shrub in between. Small trees, and you got short trees. Now, okay, let's look more deeply into what the plants might be telling us. First, pretty common plants. On the left is larch. They drop their needles. That keeps them from needing to protect their needles and leaves from the cold. They have relatively short branches, and they're pretty flexible, and so that they are so that when we get a snow load, they're not going to be broken down too much. You'll see beyond that, there are some pretty low-lying plants and little seeps. In the middle and on the far right, then you'll see the little short plants. And I've got a pen there to give you a feeling for what the size is. This is the top of Mount Chapaka. In this case, Joe Mill. And what you're going to find is those are willow trees. Yeah, willow trees. What are we talking? An inch at the most? Yeah. There's actually 3 species of willow tree, more or less like that, on the top of the mountains. Just by the pen, immediately below it, there are some little tiny catkins, less than a 1/4 inch. And this is a willow tree under alpine conditions. Plants in general, they tend to be short, and that's to accommodate frost, ultraviolet rays, wind. They're often hairy. Again, ultraviolet and cold. They're adapted to a heavy snow load. They're adapted to a short season. If the plant needs pollinators, it's going to be bumblebees more likely than not. There are other bees around, and there's flies and little beetles, butterflies, but it doesn't have the same number and kinds of pollinators as you're going to find in a much more lonely land. I'm going to take a break now, and we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, we're back. We're going to have time at the end if you want to have any questions. This is a tape program, so you can send them in to my email, which will be at the end. And I'll be glad to tell you. There's not, we don't know absolutely for sure on any of this. A lot of this is maybe, possible, looks like it, and sort of analysis, but it's a very interesting puzzle that we're working on. Okay, moving on. This is a big story I want to share with you. The big bird there is a Clark's nutcracker. This is not one of our nearby mountains, but it's the same story. The tree is a white bark pine. Below you'll see, or it's hard to see because the cones are black and they don't stand out much. There's a cone that Clark's nutcracker, they got a beak like a chisel. You don't want to mess with them. I never have. I don't plan on it. It is actually the cone, unlike the pine cones we have around here, as they mature, they open up. The seeds are caught by the wind and they're blowing around so that they can start another pine tree somewhere else. Well, this white bark pine, those do not open up at all. They're just coated with resin. And so the only way the seeds can get out is this Clark's Nutcracker. They really flock to these higher altitudes when the cones start ripening, because the seed in them, pine nut, is just, it's bigger than a pea, and they're just filled with nutrients. And so and then the Clark's Nutcrackers be up in the Alpine for a month or two before they start coming back down to lower altitudes. Well, there's just too much for them to eat at any one time. And the and the pine cone harvest, the nut harvest, some peaks, some mountaintops have a lot, and then the next year they don't. So they move. So there's a big movement around. The birds check all of them out, and then they'll settle into an area where there's a lot of cones, and they wedge and chisel those seeds out, and they'll get several in their mouth, and they fly off, and they dig a hole in the ground, and they bury the seeds. Well, sometimes they get back, and sometimes they don't. And there you have a new tree planted. Those are called a cache, a seed cache. Well, there's a lot of other animals know all about this. And when it is a primary food for grizzly bears, it's a primary food for ground squirrels, rabbits, various other rodents, other birds. But it's the Clark's Nutcracker doing all the work and caching the seeds, and then other animals get pretty dependent upon it. The trees depended on it, because if it weren't for the movement of the seeds around by the Clark's Nutcracker, you would have just this really heavily packed location, of little trees. They'd be crowding each other out and fighting each other, and not the scattered population you see in the background of this picture of white bark pine. So it's developed what we call a symbiotic relationship. That means both of them, the Clark's Nutcracker and other animals, and the white bark pine, are dependent on each other. Unfortunately, when people came from Europe to North America, and more specifically came into our area, they carried with them a disease called blister rust. And the trees in Europe, in a sense, you could say they grew up with this blister rust. They have resistance to it. They have the plant is not going to be threatened by it at all. Well, our pine, not all pines, but we call 5-needle pines. I don't know, if you look closely at a pine, they'll have a little cluster of needles. And if you count the number of needles in it, it tells you which major group of pines it belongs into. So around here, we have 2-needle pines, and that's lodgepole is primarily our 2-needle pine. We have our ponderosa pine, that's got 3 needles, and your white bark pine's got 5 needles. All 5-needle pines are susceptible to blister rust, to the point of driving them extinct in our area. This is a growing threat. Think about what we just talked about. You got a group of animals, birds, that are extremely dependent upon the seeds. You got a tree that needs the birds to spread the seeds around. And now you got a disease wiping out the white bark pine. Yeah, the western white pine is a 5-needle pine also. It's getting attacked by the same blister rust. We don't really have a way of doing much about this. It's just one of those unfortunate things that happen. There's a long history of people moving all over the world. We carry things with us, diseases that affect us, and we have animals we brought around that end up being trouble. But in this case, it's a fungus disease. But just like so many things, there is probably, and they're looking very hard for resistant white bark pine, and then finding them, getting the seeds from them, and replanting a blister rust resistant variety of white bark pine. It's a work in progress. We'll see how well this works out. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at some unique plants to the alpine. On the left is a relative of a gentian. A gentian is basically a mountain plant, has these unique little blue flowers. They have 4 petals. They open up. They have a short season. They disappear. It's because they have a short season, you just don't see them. The one on the left here is an annual, and it's about 2 inches high. It's been seen on Mount Chapaka. I have not seen it myself personally. I've looked for it. I kind of know where to look for it. I haven't seen it yet. My guess is I just got to get out up there earlier in the year. Yeah, doesn't have anything to do with being 2 inches, does it? In the middle is one called snowy cinquefoil or poinsettia. Beautiful little yellow flower, kind of like a, kind of like a buttercup, but it's a different flower than that. At the base of each petal is just a cute little orange dot. So you got the yellow and the orange. This plant, it sprawls out a little bit on what we call stolons. But the unique feature of it, it's very hairy. And on the underneath of every leaf, it is absolutely snow white. And that's the easiest characteristic to identify this plant. First, you're up on the top of some mountainous rocky place. When there are very few trees around. In fact, you have this rock rubble stuff all around you. It's really short. You flip over a leaf, and it has this just blinding white snowy cinquefoil. It's on a few of our highest peaks. I've seen it over on let's see, Tiffany. I haven't been to the top of Windy yet, but it's probably there. And it's on Chapaka, and it's on Hurley Peak. On our right is the plant that I've been doing the most research on lately. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but directly in the middle, there's this kind of aqua blue or aquamarine colored flower and it's 3 plants there, and they're in a little cluster. And that is what we call the Glaucus gentian. Glaucus is some fancy word in plant world that we use to say it's blue colored or blue tinted. And I think this is more of an aquamarine or a turquoise color. You can call it what you want. It's about 2 to 4 inches tall. Notice how easy it is to see. There could be a lot there. Now, I spent a lot of time looking for it this past summer. We found 176 plants. You could guess we missed some. Maybe there's 200 up there. But we looked really, really hard for it. 10 years ago, approximately, I was up there and found 900 plants. I have a strong suspicion this plant, they go into dormancies. They're hard to see. Then the good years, they come back. I don't know. The one on the left, it's an annual. It comes and goes to seed, and it's gone. The Glaucus gentian on the right, it's a perennial. Fleshy little leaves at the base. In this case, a little bit of a yellow color there. They're in 4s, and it has to grow up a little before it's going to flower like this. So you'll find little clusters of fleshy green leaves in these sets of 4. But boy, I tell you, you have to spend some time to get used to seeing them. They don't necessarily jump out at you. The other plants you see in these pictures that I'm not talking about are very common in these high altitude areas, alpine areas. But and so you're in the right spot. Okay. Let's take a look at some others, some common ones. This is a fall picture, and now you can see here's a different kind of willow. Here the catkins are very tall, 3 inches altogether from the ground to the top of these catkins. Then on the right, you have the paintbrush, you got lupines, you have daisies, you have you have a kind of goldenrod in the background. Pretty typical Alpine meadow. Chapaka Mountain itself is thought to be one of the most beautiful displays of alpine flowers. You know, you hike up there, let's see, late June into early July, it is spectacular. It's well worth the hike. It's a little bit vertical, but you know, you take your time. It's not bad. You know, it's easy to get there. You just walk up. You're not going to get too lost. Okay, here's a couple more common ones. Back to the willows. This is it's the same pictures, just with a slightly different angle so that you can see it, some of the catkins a little better. Again, this is a common one. There are 3 species there. Here's one of them. There's one with an oval leaf, and there's one that has a very rounded leaf. So yeah, oval, rounded. I know. I know. It's a little thing, but mostly it's going to be the catkin is different, and you have to look really close. In this case, with a little hand magnifying glass in order to check that out. Over on the right, lupine. Lupine are wonderful. Generally, all of our lowland lupines, you don't think of them as having a strong scent. You get up in these alpine meadows when you have a dominant lupine bloom, it perfumes the entire air. It's just exotic and wonderful. So lupine's a really big plant in the alpine. We're back to larch. Both you can find isolated plants like on the right, or you find them in little clusters like on the left. Back to the same picture of the larch in the fall. It's if you get a chance, there are a couple spots where you can see just great, beautiful areas. If you've ever been over to Concanelli, and then you go through Concanelli to the west and go up the West Fork and just keep going west and winding up through the hills, and you go up a place called Baldy Pass, and it's a spectacular view looking back into that West Fork of the Salmon Creek Basin. And then there's going to be a gap between the lowland larch, the western larch, and it can be a couple 100 feet, can be 1,000 feet, depends on the location, where there's no larch at all. And that's because the alpine larch lives in the alpine, and the western larch can only grow up to a certain altitude because then the winters get too harsh. And so it's not an absolute, but there's a gap between them on most cases. On the right, those leaves are a willow turning color in the fall. And then you've got the little green heather-like plant, and then you've got some little tiny huckleberry plants there. Okay. We talked about Alpine Refusia. There is a place in Wisconsin where, for some reason that nobody has a great explanation, glaciers came down from Canada and made a big loop around and made an isolated area which never was glaciated, and it has this big natural prairie in it. And in some places it's not cultivated, in some places it is, and it's now many parts of it have been turned into a big parkland by the states there. And it has in it a collection of rare plants that survived through the last glacial period. It is so different from our alpine. It's not really comparable. But if you ever get a chance to go to that Wisconsin, Minnesota area and have the chance, look it up. Okay. What about other questions? Well, alternative explanations. Back at the beginning, I talked about the natural spreading of plants. That could be that could be what happened with all these rare plants, is that they didn't need to survive on the tops of these peaks. All of the area around them would have been tundra. These are naturally tundra plants, and then they could have migrated back to these as the climate changed. Other refugia in the highlands. If we think about, there's other stories. There is a kind of iris that grows in the highlands, Molson, Chesaw, as far south as Mount Ann, and it's an endemic. An endemic means it grows in an area and nowhere else in the world. And this particular iris isn't like the big ones you have in your garden. It doesn't have uh, what what you call the banner. It's a big rounded part at the top. It just has the lower petals sticking out, and it's got 6 of them. And it's called uh, uh, the genus name is a Cicericium, and common name is blue-eyed grass. And they're very short, under maybe a foot or less. And they you got to look real close. It looks like grass, hence the name. But that it has these flowers maybe as big as a quarter. We have 2 species in our area. One of them is boy, this is a hard one just to describe, and I should have put a picture on, I think, where the lower sheath that covers the flower as it's developing is just a barely longer than the flower head itself, and then you have the little blue flowers poke out from that, and they're usually above that part. Our other species, the one that's endemic to our area and nowhere else in the world, that lower bract, B-R-A-C-T, sticks way out and is maybe a couple inches long and really thin and dagger-like. And and the flowers don't get that tall, and they're kind of just clustered around this long dagger-like lower sheath, lower bract, excuse me, on the flower. Okay, years ago, they did a genetic study. They looked at, well, actually, they looked at the chemical enzymes in the genetics of the plant. And over time, there's pretty good evidence that you can, the more plants are separated, the and isolated, they start getting a different mixture of genetics and chemicals in the plant. And it's a pretty predictable rate, not by no means absolute, but pretty predictable. You can make a good estimate about how long a plant has been separated from others like itself. Where ours, this Cicericium, this blue-eyed grass with the long daggered lower bract, has been alive and in existence in our area since, well, somewhere in the middle of the last big glaciation. Well, that means it had to come somewhere, but everywhere in its habitat today was completely covered by ice. How did it get here? And it's not the only plant that kind of raises that same question. So there's that possibility. The plants are saying something. Yeah, sure, they may have been brought in by natural means, via animal or via the wind. Cicericium seeds don't get spread by wind, and they don't spread very far. Period. Okay, raises a question. They're just the seeds are like little dots, not much else. So there is some evidence there was other refugia area, and if you think back to that one map we had showing the Brett's floods area, there are valleys and areas that weren't glaciated at the edge of the ice at that time. Who knows? Maybe there were survivors in it. Speculation, just thoughts. Climate change impacts. Hey, if you think climate's changed now, think back to 5,000 feet of ice and compare that today. Yeah, we get climate change. There's no kidding. The only question is how fast and in what direction. Well, right now, climate change is happening pretty darn fast compared to historical times. And what the impact of that is plants and animals are used to change. They're adaptable. The difference is you're talking about change over hundreds of years. And so plants move around by natural means to find more advantageous places. On our mountain peaks, one of the natural things to do would be move up higher where it's cooler and you can survive the heat and the drought. Well, after a while, you run out of mountaintop. And that's what we're faced today with these Nunataks in our area. These rare complexes of plants, they don't have anywhere to go. They're running out of territory. Okay. In the greater world, given all the other things, is it a big deal? Maybe not. But diversity in general, in all ways, gives you a better chance of survival, because you never know what are positive features in the future. Human impacts, roads, parks, inordinate number of hikers, grazing, fires. You go on and on. Human impacts are as our population grows, as we're more capable of getting places with machinery, with where we normally would be a long hike in, and that limited who is there under what circumstances. Human impact's getting to be a bigger and bigger thing. Fire. It is a constant companion with our ecosystem in Eastern Washington. We just happen to be seeing a lot of big ones now, but we have that additional problem of the increasing drought, and more people and amount and fires in my lifetime have gotten more frequent and very much larger. So and if you go to the top of Mount Chapaka, I can find chunks of charred wood on the very top. And that's at least the best history I can find shows that all of that area was burned severely shortly after 1900. Just now, we're starting to see a few alpine larches, a few white bark pine starting to grow at similar altitudes again. You're talking over 100 years for trees to come back to the tops of the mountain. So as fires get more and more frequent, if they do, then there's not going to be that opportunity for the reclaiming of these various parts of the landscape by these slow recolonizations by the natural world. That's going to have an impact. Some species will not survive. I'm glad to field your questions. Thanks for viewing. There's my email. Love to hear from you. Just write me at that, and I'll give you whatever response I can. Thanks for listening to OHA. Bye for now.
Hey, I have one more question for you.
Sure. Go
that
on.
I think would be kind of a neat addition to this. So kind of related to human impacts and people exploring our area.
Yes.
Do you have recommendations of what people can do when they're exploring these mountaintops and encountering rare plants, both in terms of like being careful around them to try to minimize their impacts, and also, do you know of any citizen science opportunities where people can take pictures or send in pictures that they have? So those are my two separate questions.
Okay, let's deal with the first one. How can you cause as an individual the least impact? There is the whole thing of no trace, that you don't, your practices, you don't leave marks. You don't hack at a tree. You don't dig holes. If you're in muddy areas, stay away from it, because your imprint will last dozens of years. Particularly wet spots are that way. Stay on the main trails as much as possible. If you see a pretty flower, take a picture. Don't take the flower. Okay, go up and enjoy the time. Think about it, and if the opportunity comes up, be willing to make a comment about how important it is to keep these places largely intact. They're already struggling. We don't want to add more impact than necessary. So that's participation and keeping these places as untrammeled as possible. And then no trace. We talk about no trace camping. Well, no trace activities. Yeah. Now, the second question you bring up is, are there organizations? There's the Washington Trails Association. Well, it's dedicated to trails, but it's talking about similar areas. You have the Rare Care out of the University of Washington, and that's the group I work for more than anybody else. Where they'll train you in looking for and inventorying and doing the mapping of all of rare plants in the state of Washington. They're not necessarily alpine. They could be all kinds of places. We have several in the highlands. We have a yellow lady slipper that's very, very rare and scattered around. We have a couple of other orchids that are really, really, really rare in the Okanogan Highlands. And you get that, it's just a neat feeling to know that you're helping, as well as, this is pretty dang special. And you can get a picture and you can keep that picture and you're not doing any harm at all. There's a type of orchid that is found nowhere else in the state of Washington except in the Cape Labelle area. And in general in that area, it's extreme. There's only maybe a total of 40 plants discovered totally in the state of Washington, and they're all in our area. We don't know why, they're just there. In another area, there's a type of huckleberry, and it's not found, again, nowhere else in the state of Washington. It's pretty common back east. Okay, why is it here? We don't know, but it is here. And so keeping that there, that little bit of genetic diversity can make a big difference.
Yeah.
But those are two examples that are easy for me to bring up. That many rare plants are incredibly obscure. They're difficult to see. Very few of them are big and showy. And a lot of them are maybe, and I'll underline maybe, rare because they're hard to find, not because there's a very limited number of them. Most of them, though, are restricted to very special small habitats, unusual places. Common rule: unusual plants are found in unusual places. Not always, but it's a good rule of thumb. So if you're in an area which is, man, I haven't seen this before, this is really different, you might step a little more carefully. You don't know what's there.
Sounds like good advice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Many thanks to George for sharing his expertise and his time with us. Also, thank you to Confluence Health for their support of Okanogan Highlands Alliance's education program. OHA is a member-supported nonprofit organization. If you are interested in learning more about OHA or becoming a member, please visit our website, okanoganhighlands.org, or send us an email at info@okanoganhighlands.org. We're looking forward to more events and connecting with you more in 2022. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Till next time.